So a classic example of this being done is Thomas Jefferson. So you may be familiar that Thomas Jefferson wrote compiled what's called the Jefferson Bible. And he went through the New Testament, and he wanted to get a picture of Jesus. He liked the whole idea of Jesus and Jesus as a moral teacher and that sort of thing, but he didn't believe in all the miracles. And so he went through and he excised all the supernatural parts of the New Testament. What he was doing was basically the same kind of thing that's going on in that time period and after in this quest for the historical Jesus. Let's get rid of all these miracles so we can really figure out who this Jesus really was and what he said and what he taught. So when you compare those two, you realize the Bible just isn't myth. It has none of the characteristics that we see in mythology. It's just completely different. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So we are on our last lesson on the Bible, and we've looked at the question of why should we believe that the Bible is the Word of God. We've seen reasons why to believe the Bible is the Word of God. We've looked at the question of why we accept certain books as authoritative and we don't accept other books as authoritative, the question of the canon. We've looked at the question of other religious texts and why we don't believe or accept other religious texts. We've looked at the question of our actual text that we possess in our Bibles. How can we have confidence that that text actually represents what was originally written? In our last lesson, we looked at the various approaches that scholars make in studying the Bible, what we called biblical criticism. So we looked at things like textual criticism, classical criticism, form criticism, source criticism, and redaction criticism. And we looked at the strengths and the weaknesses and the problems with each one of those. And so that really brings us to the question today of the historical reliability of the Bible. Okay. And there are, and I think I mentioned this the last time we were together, there are certain parts of the Bible, certain books of the Bible, which are particularly foundational to our faith. Okay, and those are what are called the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and of course the Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament. And it's that area of the historicity, the reliability, the credibility of those particular 9 books that have come under really vigorous attack by scholars and skeptics and critics, particularly over the last couple hundred years. And so that's what we want to look at today and explore those avenues of attack that have come. I've got several resources for you there. Of course, again, I think I've mentioned, all of these before. McDowell's The Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Bruce's on the New Testament, the reliability of the New Testament. Balcom has a really good book on the Gospels as eyewitness testimony and how we can know, why we know that that's actually eyewitness testimony that we're reading when we read the Gospels. Oswald has this book, The Bible Among the Myths, in which he explores this whole question of, is the Bible myth, and he demonstrates why we can understand and know that the Bible is a totally different category from mythology, and we'll explore some of that today. Kitchen's book on the reliability of the Old Testament, and Cohen's book, Cohen and Wilder's book on the defense of the Bible. And then I've listed there for you a couple books on archaeology. There's a number of books on biblical archaeology that are out there that are good. This is just a couple that I've used and read that are just really good sources on archaeological support for the Bible. So those are some sources. So the first thing I want to talk about today is what's called the documentary hypothesis, okay? Or you may hear it referred to as the Graf-Wellhausen theory or the Wellhausen theory or hypothesis, and sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the JEPD theory, okay? And this documentary hypothesis is focused on the question of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, okay? What we call the books of Moses. And it has roots that go further back than this, but Wellhausen was really the first guy to really formulate a cohesive theory that we call the documentary hypothesis. And some of the primary features of it, one of it is it denies the Mosaic authorship. So Wellhausen and those who followed in his stead deny that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and they deny the historical credibility of the Pentateuch. So their argument actually is that the Pentateuch was actually written many hundreds of years up to a millennium after it actually was purported to have been written. So part of the basis of Wellhausen's theory was Tyler's evolutionary theory of religion. So if you think back when we taught about monotheism, we talked about the evolutionary view of religion, that religion started in very ancient primitive peoples. It started with mana and moved into animism, and then into polytheism, and then into henotheism, and ultimately as civilization advanced into monotheism. And so this idea of this is how religion evolved or developed in civilizations, we talked about that many lessons ago. And we showed that whole theory of the evolutionary model of religion just doesn't hold water. Anthropologically, ethnologically, archaeologically, we've just seen that particular theory doesn't hold any water. So that aspect of the Wellhausen theory has been discredited, as well as I mentioned, some other aspects that we'll talk about today. Okay, and the interesting thing is, and you have a handout on Wellhausen's theory there that you can look at later that brings this out, but the interesting thing is that most scholars today recognize that the documentary hypothesis just doesn't work, okay? And so it's been pretty much discredited, but the interesting thing is, or the peculiar thing about it is, it's still being taught, okay? So it's actually still being taught in seminaries. There's liberal pastors who are still using it and teaching it to their congregations and that sort of thing. So you're still likely to encounter this with people, even though it's been really kind of out of popularity among leading scholars for a long time, for over 100 years. So the primary claims of the documentary hypothesis is that the Pentateuch is actually a compilation, a grouping together of 4 separate documents or 4 separate writings that were written by 4 different authors, or even in some cases more authors than that, depending on the person you're talking to, okay? And these authors are typically identified as J, E, D, and P, okay? So the J stands for the Jehovah's, okay? So supposedly some of the Pentateuch was written by this author, and he would be considered to be the earliest author, and that would be dated for around the time of David to Solomon, so about 850 BC. So we're already talking about a period that's 500 years or more after we believe Moses lived, okay? And these the events that we see in the Pentateuch, particularly in the latter part of the Pentateuch, happened 500 years before this guy wrote. Okay, and then there's another author who's believed to have written other parts of it. He's referred to as the Elohist, and he's believed to have written about 100 years after the Jehovahist. And then you get to the Deuteronomist, who is believed to have written around the time of Josiah. So now we're getting towards the latter part of the divided kingdom. And then you have the priestly author or editor, and he was believed to have written during the period of the Babylonian captivity. So we're talking 600 BC or so. Okay, so these various authors are believed to have contributed various portions of what we have today as the Pentateuch, and then these were supposedly all edited by anonymous individuals, and in fact the JED and P, they're all anonymous too. We don't really know who they were, but these were then supposedly edited by these various individuals and compiled about 1,000 years after the events supposedly occurred. Okay, and then they were compiled together supposedly during the period right at the end of the prophets, so 500 to 400 BC. So this would be right around the time of the end of the Old Testament, Malachi and that sort of thing. And so it was at this point then, as believed by the documentarians, that the Pentateuch was all combined into one total collection. Okay. The arguments that they make for those claims are one is that as you read the Pentateuch, according to the documentarians, you see different characteristics. You see things that to them reflect different authorship. So, for example, some places in the Pentateuch you encounter the name of Yahweh or Jehovah, okay, and so that's attributed to the Jehovahs, the writer who used Jehovah or Yahweh as a name, okay, and in other cases, another author uses, or supposedly another author uses the name Elohim, so they don't think it's possible that one author could have used two different names for God, okay? And then there are repetitions as you read through the Pentateuch. You'll get repetitions of things. So, for example, there's two accounts in Genesis of creation, one in chapter 1 and one in chapter 2. They attribute those to different authors. And they also think that they see some contradictions or things that they think contradict each other. And then there's things that just don't seem to them to be congruent with the idea of a single author of Moses. And one reason is it's all written in the third person, right? So Moses never refers to himself in the personal pronoun. He always refers to himself in the third person. And they think, well, this means that he couldn't have written it. And then, of course, at the end of the Pentateuch, you have the account, a few verses on the account of the death of Moses, which, of course, obviously Moses didn't write. And so that's part of their argument. And then there's, linguistically speaking, there are certain anachronisms. Of course, we wouldn't pick up, we're not Hebrew scholars or Semitic language scholars, but those who are pick up what they think as they read the Hebrew text. They see words that they think have a kind of an Aramaic origin to them, and the Aramaic language didn't develop until sometime after this period of time. And so they think that these words, phrases, and those sorts of things that they think have this Aramaic flavor to them are an indication that they were written later. So these are the arguments that they make, but there's certain presuppositions that underlie their arguments, all right? And so one presupposition is the priority of source analysis or source criticism. So in our last lesson 2 weeks ago, we talked about source criticism, that clearly there are some some authors of Scripture clearly use sources. We know that because in places they referred to sources. So, for example, Moses in Deuteronomy refers to the wars of Jehovah. Some document, we don't know what it was, we don't know what it contained, but he refers to it. And other authors refer to sources that they use. So Luke refers to sources that he referred to or that he used. And we see Paul citing various hymns and creeds and that sort of thing. So we know that the biblical authors, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, we know the biblical authors use sources, but oftentimes what source criticism does is it assumes that there are sources that we don't really know whether or not they were there, right? And so we talked about how that can really lead to problems when you start making a lot of speculation and suppositions that aren't justified. What happens with the documentary hypothesis and the documentarians is they put a great deal of emphasis on source criticism, and they tend to dismiss or diminish the importance of actual objective archaeology. So there's a great deal of emphasis on the subjective as opposed to the objective. Then they have, as I mentioned, they have this natural view of religion, so-called natural view of religion, this evolutionary view of religion that we talked about, and particularly of Israel's history. So their view is that Israel's religion developed along this same evolutionary line, and that the monotheistic God that we see represented from the very beginning in Genesis and all the way through the Pentateuch, that monotheistic view of God did not develop in Jewish culture and in Jewish religious belief until much later period of time. So this is a presupposition that they make. They also assume that there was no literary writing. So there's crude hieroglyphics and things like that, but there wasn't literary writing as we see in the Pentateuch. There was not that kind of literary writing in civilization at that time. So literary writing supposedly didn't develop until hundreds of years later. And then there's the idea that there's that early date, we're talking here 13th to 15th century BC, okay, that at that early date, that was too early for there to be developed moral codes. So of course what we see in Exodus through Deuteronomy is we see a very, very highly developed, sophisticated moral code, okay? And the idea is with the documentarians is that was just too early, that in society and cultures and civilizations that early, you couldn't have that sophisticated, that developed moral code. And this goes back, of course, to this evolutionary idea of religion, okay? So particularly like the patriarchal narratives, the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and of course Jacob's sons and Joseph, these are all believed just to be legendary. They're just believed to be myths that just developed among the Jews over a period of time, and then at that much later date then were written down into folk literature that eventually became the Pentateuch. Okay? So what are the problems with the documentary hypothesis? I've already hinted at some of them, but one of them is, of course, this heavy reliance upon source criticism, which relies, particularly with the documentarians, relies a great deal on supposition, on assumptions, on speculation, that sort of thing. And there's this heavy reliance upon that, while on the other hand we have actual objective archaeological evidence that points in the other direction. They tend to dismiss that or ignore that and rely more heavily on source criticism. One of the reasons for that is when Wellhausen developed his theory, archaeology had not yet really begun as a science. So archaeology begins to develop towards the end of the 19th century as a scientific endeavor, and so it's only towards the end of the 19th century, the first part of the 20th century, that you really begin to get the kind of archaeological discoveries that we have now that support the Bible. So in one sense, you could say Wellhausen could be excused a little bit for some of his conclusions because he didn't have the archaeological resources that became available later. But also, one of the problems with such a reliance on source criticism is we don't have any extant sources. We don't have any copies of manuscripts or whatever from any of these, any authors of that, about the story of Israel outside of the Bible for that time period. Okay, so the only source we have is the Bible. So when they're using source criticism to look at the question of where did the Pentateuch come from, the only source they have is the Pentateuch itself, and conclusions or suppositions or speculations they make from their reading of the text itself, because we don't have any other sources. We don't have any external sources. We don't have any manuscripts. We don't even have references in other ancient writings to these supposed authors. So these authors, J, E, D, and P, are the construction of the documentarians. They're not, and they're constructed by their perception of the text they're reading, of the Pentateuch. They're not people or characters that are identified from some other writing somewhere, or some external source, or some extra biblical source. We have no references to any authors like that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, you have a number of archaeological discoveries that really point in the opposite direction. And we'll talk about some of those here in a minute, that really have proven the fallacy of the documentary hypothesis. And like I said, to some degree, Wellhausen could be forgiven for some of his conclusions because he didn't have the resources we have today. But one of the things that we have learned from archaeology is that, in fact, there was widespread literary writing at that time frame and before. So in the time frame that we're talking about with Moses again, so we're talking about the middle to the latter part of the second millennium BC, we have archaeological discovery now of literary construction, literary writing that took place in that time. So the idea that Moses couldn't have written something like that, or somebody in that time frame couldn't have written something like that, is clearly false, because we have examples. And also the idea that there couldn't be any kind of an advanced religious code at that early date has also been proven false. In 1901, they actually discovered a copy of the Hammurabi Code, which is dated to 1800 BC, so clear back to the time of Abraham. So the Hammurabi, actually we knew about the Hammurabi Code before this, but we actually discovered an actual copy of it in stone in 1901. So we have, in the Hammurabi Code, we have a very sophisticated, highly developed ethical code, moral code developed in the Hammurabi Code. So clearly, the idea that you couldn't have had a highly developed code, moral code, that early in civilization is clearly not true, because now we have an extant example. We have something you can literally put your hands on, so to speak. Okay. So another problem, of course, is that we just have a great deal of testimony to the Mosaic authorship. So even within the Pentateuch itself, there are places in the Pentateuch that attribute those various portions of the Pentateuch to Moses himself. Then you have, throughout the Old Testament, beginning with the very early prophets like Joshua, from the very earliest time after Moses, you have an attribution of the authorship of the 5 books to Moses. So you have Joshua, you have Daniel, you have the chronicler who wrote 1 Kings, you have Malachi, Nehemiah. All these Jews down through the history of the Old Testament attribute the Pentateuch to Moses. Then you have, in the New Testament, of course, Jesus repeatedly gives Moses credit for the Pentateuch. Paul does, John does, Peter does, Luke in chapter 2 of Luke, he gives credit to Moses for the 5 books. And then you have external evidence outside of the Bible. So you have, for example, Jewish tradition. So just the fact that the Jews include the Pentateuch in their canon as part of their inspired scripture, in part because they believe it was written by a prophet, Moses. Okay? Then you have in the Old Testament, we talked about the Old Testament Apocrypha several weeks ago, and one of the books in the Old Testament Apocrypha is the book of Ecclesiasticus, and in Ecclesiasticus it refers to the law which Moses enacted. The Talmud refers to the Mosaic authorship. Philo, who was a first century Jewish philosopher, and Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian, both attribute the first five books of the Old Testament to Moses. So we have a substantial body of testimony beginning from right after the time of Moses with Joshua and all down through history of Jewish recognition of the Mosaic authorship. Okay? And while we have all of that evidence, we don't have any evidence at all from any source referring to any of these other supposed authors. There's no indication from any other either biblical writing or extra biblical writings that talk anything about these other supposed writers. So there's no evidence whatsoever to support that. That's all basically supposition and speculation. A third problem, of course, with the hypothesis is it's operating off of a naturalistic or materialistic presupposition. So in other words, the reason these scholars want to discount Mosaic authorship and the credibility of the historicity of the Pentateuch is because they have a naturalistic worldview, and so they want to discount the whole idea of God's action in history that we see represented. So again, this whole idea, this is where this idea of the evolutionary view of religion comes into play. So in order to discount the idea that God actually revealed these things to Moses and then Moses passed them on to us, their explanation for the view of God and the worldview that's centered around the God of the Bible, they explain that through this kind of so-called evolutionary process of religion. But of course, as we saw when we looked at that question of the evolutionary development of religion, we saw that the evidence just flies in the face of that. There are no anthropologists, ethnologists today, no reputable ones anyway, who really make any effort to attempt to defend this evolutionary view. And finally, fourth, as I mentioned, we now have archaeological evidence of the development of moral codes much earlier than the documentarians believed. And then the fifth point, another problem with the whole hypothesis, is that Kitchens, that I mentioned as one of the authors that I mentioned there at the beginning, and other Old Testament scholars have demonstrated both the antiquity of the Pentateuch and the historical reliability of the Pentateuch. And so I've got several examples for you there that I thought were interesting. One is there's a section there in the book of Numbers, a couple 3 chapters there that talk about the prophet Balaam. We now actually have an excavation of a stone, a stele, what they call, with engravings referring to this prophet in this time period. Okay, so we actually have archaeological evidence, extra biblical evidence for Balaam the prophet. Another thing that's fascinating is when the story is told about Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, it actually names the price at 20 shekels, okay, 20 shekels of silver. And what's fascinating about that is we now know from archaeology what the price of slaves was at various times in ancient history. And it turns out that in the period prior to the 18th century BC, 17th century BC, in the time prior to that, the price of slaves was lower than the price that's given for Joseph. And as you move later in history, particularly as you get up into the period of time when the documentarians say these things were written, the price of slaves was much higher. It gets up to be 2 and 3 and 4 times higher. Okay, so it's inflation like we know today, right? So everything gets more expensive. So the question is, how would somebody writing 1,000 years or 800 years after the story of Joseph supposedly occurred, how would they have known, how could they have possibly known what the price of a slave would have been at that time? We know now because we've made archaeological discoveries and uncovered things that tell us what slaves were sold for, but of course they didn't have those resources. Another thing that's interesting is the Egyptian name that's given to Joseph when he's finally elevated out of prison, and he's elevated up to be second in power to Pharaoh. He's given an Egyptian name, and then it talks also about his wife's name. Both of those names Egyptologists recognize as being Egyptian names that come from that particular time period. Okay, so they're dated for that time period of around 1800 BC. Okay. And then there's another thing that's really fascinating. Of course, we know that God represented his relationship with Israel as a covenant or as a treaty, okay? And that's what the whole Sinai thing is. God is entering into a covenant with, into a treaty with the people of Israel. And that's how he represents their relationship, okay? And he's doing this because people understood covenants. They understood treaties from their culture and from the world around them. They understood those. And so that's the way that God explains his relationship to Israel, right? What's fascinating is these treaties, particularly what are called suzerainty treaties or suzerainty vassal treaties, were treaties between political entities like nations or kingdoms or city-states or whatever, okay? And what we particularly have is we have a number of Hittite treaties that we have from various periods of time, okay? And what's interesting is that the structure of these treaties changed over time. They kind of evolved over time. So at one point in history they were structured in one way, and then later they were structured another way. The fascinating thing is that the book of Deuteronomy, the outline of the book of Deuteronomy fits very closely, virtually parallel to the Hittite suzerainty treaty outlines from that period of time, from 13th, 15th century BC. So what's interesting is that when Moses composes and writes down the treaty that God is giving to him, it's written in the style, in the same outline form as the suzerainty treaties of the surrounding nations and cultures are written at the time, rather than a time much later. So this indicates again the timing of when the Pentateuch was written is not at this much later date, but is in fact earlier, as we've always believed. Okay, so we have great reason to have confidence in both the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch and the credibility, the reliability, and the historicity of the Pentateuch. So then that leads us up then to the second issue, which has to do with the Gospels and the effort to undermine our confidence in the Gospels. And so there is a movement that developed called the Life of Jesus movement, or you may have heard of it more commonly referred to as the quest for the historical Jesus. Now actually, as you'll see here in a minute, there have been kind of three quests. But when somebody just simply refers to the quest for the historical Jesus, usually they're referring to this first quest, okay? This actually began in the late 18th century, so late 1700s, and then to the 19th century, okay? And the idea of the quest for the historical Jesus was they were attempting to construct a picture of Jesus from the Gospels that eliminated all the supernatural junk and got rid of all that, okay? So a classic example of this being done is Thomas Jefferson. So you may be familiar that Thomas Jefferson compiled what's called the Jefferson Bible. And he went through the New Testament, and he wanted to get a picture of Jesus. He liked the whole idea of Jesus and Jesus as a moral teacher and that sort of thing, but he didn't believe in all the miracles. And so he went through and he excised all the supernatural parts of the New Testament and just left the natural parts, okay, or the non-miraculous parts, okay. What he was doing was basically the same kind of thing that's going on in that time period and after in this quest for the historical Jesus. Let's get rid of all these miracles so we can really figure out who this Jesus really was and what he said and what he taught, okay. So what you end up is what we think of as a liberal Jesus, okay. So this liberal Jesus then, and he's parallel to the same thing that liberal theologians think of today. Jesus is this kind of really great ethical, moral teacher, okay? But we're going to just dispense with all this theology that's attached to Jesus. So his messianic claims, his claims to be God, his teachings about theology, all that sort of stuff, we're going to shove that aside. We just want this really good moral, ethical teacher, all right? So of course, then you have to get rid of all the myths, all the miracles, so the miracles are all viewed as mythology or legend. But by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, the first quest really kind of runs out of steam. And one of the reasons for that is, one of the things the quest was trying to do is it was trying to go back to the earliest documents we have. Okay, well, most scholars believe that the first gospel that was written was the Gospel of Mark, okay, and that Matthew and Luke depended some on Mark. So Mark would be the earliest source, but many scholars believe, both conservative and liberal scholars, believe that behind Matthew, Mark, and Luke is a document called Q. Okay, that there was a document that we no longer have called, they refer to as Q, which stands for quotations, and the Q document is believed, again, by many liberals and many conservative scholars, was believed to consist of just the quotations of the teachings of Jesus. So it didn't tell all the stories or whatever, it just consisted of the teachings. And so they believe that when they look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke and they see virtually word for word repetition or quotations from Jesus that are the same in the various Gospels, that represents dependence on this Q source. Now, not all conservative scholars accept that, but many do, and it's really neither here nor there, as long as we believe that the four Gospels are the inspired Word of God. So, to me, it's not that critical of an issue. But in the quest for the historical Jesus, they would look at Mark, and they would look at what they thought the Q document said, and what they found was they couldn't separate Jesus' ethical teachings from his theological claims. That they were just too closely interwoven together, and so they couldn't succeed in separating them and discovering this so-called historical Jesus. So this whole idea of this kind of liberal Jesus that you see in the Life of Jesus movement was actually just a projection on the Gospels of liberal theology. So it was liberal theologians thinking that this is the way Jesus must have been, and so that was imposed upon their approach to the Gospels, and this is where you get the quest for the historical Jesus, which, as I said, by the end of the 19th century just lost steam because they couldn't really prove it from the earliest text. Then you get a period after that of a time of transition, and this starts early in the 20th century and then on through the middle of the 20th century. And here again, people are still trying to figure out what is the Jesus of history, okay, as opposed to the Jesus of faith. Right? So one of the leading voices in this was Karl Barth, who's a German theologian. And to him, the actual events of Jesus' life aren't really, what was so important. Okay, and he thought we really can't know for sure about the events of Jesus' life. So he didn't have any real confidence in the historicity of the Gospels. And what's interesting, he's applying a double standard there, because he accepts that historically we know about Caesar and these other people who lived back then based on the historical documents, but for some reason we can't really trust the historical documents we have of Jesus, but he wasn't really bothered by that. Okay, so he thought what was really important was not what Jesus really was, but the Jesus we preach and believe. Okay, so it really doesn't matter what was real, what really happened back then. What really matters is what do we believe about Jesus today, and that's what's really important and life-changing. And then you get a guy I mentioned a couple weeks ago, Rudolf Bultmann, who, as I mentioned, was the originator of form criticism, and he actually maintained that everything we actually knew about Jesus historically could be written on a 4x6 card. Okay, so that's all we really know about Jesus. But that, again, didn't really bother him. He thought most of the Gospels were mythological, but he wasn't troubled by that, because what he thought was, well, there's myth there, but there's a kernel of truth underneath the myth. Not historical truth, but theological or philosophical or metaphysical truth is underlies myth. So it doesn't matter whether it's real history or whether it's myth. What really matters is the seed of truth underneath it. So what he was after that seed of truth. He wasn't bothered about whether or not these things were really historical. So what's really important for him was the Christ idea, not the actual Christ of history. Okay, so this is a period of transition between the historical quest for Jesus and what is sometimes referred to as the second quest. And then this picks up towards the middle part of the 20th century and proceeds even up to some degree today. And a couple really well-known proponents of the second quest, or activists in the second quest. One is what's called the Jesus Seminar. You may have heard of the Jesus Seminar. So the Jesus Seminar is a collection of scholars who get together. They're very skeptical scholars regarding the Gospels and the stories of Jesus, and they publish and they write, and they're very news media is very infatuated with them, because they're always coming up with these very controversial claims about Jesus and the Bible and that sort of thing. Another voice of this second movement, second quest, is Bart Ehrman, who's a well-known agnostic or atheist New Testament scholar. And he's kind of part of this second quest movement. And of course the second quest developed in part because of the failure of the first quest. So in some degree they're trying to do the same thing but take a slightly different approach from it. What they're trying to do is they're trying to disassociate the Jesus of history from the theology of the early church. So I alluded to this in our last lesson, that these scholars, when they look at things in the New Testament, if they see something in the New Testament that they know is associated with the beliefs of the early church, then they conclude that that had nothing to do with Jesus, that Jesus didn't teach those things, okay? So again, they're trying to separate the theology of Jesus from the historicity of Jesus. So they're assuming that the Gospels historically are not authentic. That's just, so in other words, instead of approaching an historical text, giving it the benefit of the doubt, they come at the text assuming that the text is inauthentic unless it can be proven or demonstrated to be true. Okay? So as I mentioned, they resist ascribing any theology of the early church to Jesus. So any of the things that the early church believed, they assume did not come from Jesus unless it can be proven that Jesus actually taught those things. So they talk, and actually these terms get kind of used interchangeably in different ways, but primarily the idea is they're trying to distinguish the historical Jesus from what they call the Jesus of history. So the Jesus of history would be the man who really lived. So there was really a man, Jesus, who lived back then. Okay, that's the Jesus of history. But the historical Jesus is the things we can actually know about him from history. So there's that guy back there, but there's only a few things we can actually know about him. So there's the Jesus of history who really lived, and then there's just there's a few things that we can actually know about him. That would be the historical Jesus. So with this second quest, there's a great deal of emphasis on this idea of myth as opposed to history. So what they want to do is they want to demythologize Jesus. They want to get rid of all the mythology that developed around Jesus from the early church, get rid of that so that they can actually discover the true Jesus. So they're trying to find again the truth behind the myth. Not so much the kernel of truth that we were talking about with Boltman, okay? So not so much the kernel of truth, but rather the historical truth. What is the historical truth about Jesus that lies behind all this mythology that's developed about him and then been written down in the Gospels? And there are here again a number of problems with the second quest. One, of course, again, it's operating from a strictly naturalistic point of view. So it's starting from the assumption that God does not intervene in history in this way, that miracles don't occur, that Jesus is not God. So it's an attempt to approach the New Testament from a strictly naturalistic point of view. And then it makes this kind of unjustified assumption that any theology of the early church doesn't originate in Jesus. There's really no reason to assume that other than just your presupposition that it doesn't. Okay, and then, of course, again, as I mentioned, it assumes the inauthenticity of the New Testament rather than the authenticity. So anything in the Gospels, we're just going to assume it's fault unless somehow we can establish that it's fault. And then the other thing they do, and I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, and this is where it comes into play, is they misuse the criteria of authenticity. So you remember a couple weeks ago I talked about how in ancient texts there are certain things that when you see them, they just speak authenticity to you. Okay, they're called the criteria of authenticity, and there are about 5 or 6 of these, particularly regarding the Gospels. One of them I mentioned is embarrassing material. Okay, so for example, Peter's denial of Christ. Okay, that's embarrassing material. It's unlikely that the Gospel writers would have included the story of Peter's denial of Jesus unless it really happened, because it's really kind of embarrassing for the leadership of the church. So why would the church put that in there if it didn't really happen? Another example would be the faith of the women, particularly around the resurrection, in contrast to the men. So the women are the first ones to the tomb. They're the first ones to really believe in the resurrection. And in the culture of the time, that's embarrassing that the women would be the first ones to really believe and the first ones to actually see Jesus and see the resurrected Lord. So that's embarrassing material. Why would the early writers have included that if that's not in fact how things happen? So these are some of the criteria of authenticity. And as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, the value of the criteria of authenticity is that they add to our prior confidence in the Scripture or in the text. Okay, so they're used in a positive sense. So I may approach a text and the text doesn't have any of the 5 or 6 criteria of authenticity, but that's not a reason not to believe the text. So I may still believe the text even if it doesn't have any of the criteria of authenticity. All right. But if I do see something like embarrassment, or if I do see something, for example, a geographical reference or something that is clearly authentic, then that increases my confidence in the authenticity of the text. What the second quest does with the authenticity of criteria is they make them a necessary criteria to believe the text. So they say not that a criteria of authenticity enhances our confidence text. What they say is there has to be a criteria of authenticity there, or I won't believe the text. Okay? But they go even further than that. They say all the criteria have to be there. So they won't believe a text unless they see all the criteria of authenticity in a given part of the story or a given part of the text. All right? Which is just an unreasonable way to use the criteria of authenticity, and most scholars recognize that that's just not a valid use. And again, the assumption is that the Gospels are a different kind of literature than history. They're not history, they're mythology, okay? But as we'll see, as historians have studied the text, and we'll see this more again when we do our study on the life of Christ, when historians study the text and study the Gospels, they've clearly identified that the Gospels are written in the form of Greco-Roman biography. So they're written in the same way that other historical biographies were written by Greco-Roman authors of the time. So they recognize now that the Gospels are not mythological, but they are in fact Greco-Roman bio. And the second quest fails to recognize the significance of that. And then we have actually an encouraging development, and that is the third quest, okay, or what's sometimes referred to as the third quest, or the Jewish reclamation of Jesus. And this is an exciting development because now we're talking about Jewish scholars, okay? So we're not talking about Jewish Christians, we're talking about Jewish scholars, okay? And what's happened with the Jewish scholarship about the Gospels and about Jesus is they've begun to approach Jesus from a rather appreciative frame of reference. Okay, so they're actually kind of seeking to incorporate Jesus into, or understand how Jesus fits into the fold of Judaism. So they're not trying to see him as this weird, far out character, but as a rabbi who really functioned within first century Palestinian Judaism. And of course, as Jewish scholars, they focus primarily on Jesus' moral teachings, his ethical teachings, and that sort of thing, but not to the exclusion of his theological claims. So they interpret Jesus then through the context of Jewish culture and of Jewish faith. So that's how they view Jesus, that's how they interpret Jesus, rather than trying to interpret him as some kind of mythological creation of the early church. So they have much more respect for the Gospels than you see oftentimes with liberal Christian scholars. So they have a great deal of confidence in the Gospel records as being valid history. So Jesus, by these Jewish scholars then, is seen to be a very real first century Jewish person, okay, about whom we can know a great deal from the historical gospel records that we have of him. And they notice that Jesus characterizes many of the things that they see with other first century Jewish rabbis. So they see him using some of the techniques in his teaching that they know that rabbis in first century Palestine used. For example, his use of mnemonic aids when he's teaching. And they know that Jewish rabbis in that time period relied a lot on mnemonic aids, particularly when they were teaching children. They also see that a number of Jesus' ethical teachings, while of course they were at odds to some degree oftentimes with what the Pharisees were doing or what the Sadducees were doing, what they see is that Jesus' ethical teachings, many of his ethical teachings fit with some of the things that other rabbis were teaching and emphasizing in that time period. And here's the interesting thing, is they recognize that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Okay, so they actually acknowledge that Jesus made these messianic claims. Now, of course, they're Jews, so they don't believe the messianic claims, but they acknowledge that he made them, which is, of course, a tremendous step forward from both the first and second quest. And so, partly as a product of this third quest, and certainly within the Jewish scholars who are part of this, people are no longer viewing the Gospels as mythology. They're viewing them rather than mythology, they're viewing them as historical documents. So when we think about this contrast, when people come to the Bible or come to the Gospels as myth, they're coming, of course, oftentimes with this materialistic or this naturalistic view of the Bible, and they're viewing the Gospels as this collection of myths that were sourced in one of two places. So oftentimes the claim will be that these stories about Jesus, his virgin birth, his 12 disciples, his resurrection, and various aspects of Jesus' life, they try to find parallels in the mythology of the surrounding religions, and then they say, well, the church just borrowed these myths from other religions and then just modified them, incorporated them into the Christian church. And in some cases they believe that these mythologies of Jesus were just created out of whole cloth by the early church. As the years passed on and these supposedly these stories of Jesus were passed down over generations before they were written. We've seen, of course, that that's not true, but their belief that it was true allows for this incorporation of these kind of mythological ideas about Jesus. So this is where they get this idea. But the growing consensus among scholars today is that mythological literature and the Bible come from two entirely different worldviews. So when you read mythology, you get a completely different worldview than you get when you read the Bible or when you read the Gospels. So if you think about a comparison, if you read mythology, you're going to get a lot of polytheism. You're going to get the whole idea of images in the shape of the deities, so images of made out of wood or nature and that sort of thing that represent the deity. You're going to get the idea that matter is chaotic and it's eternal. You're going to get the idea that personality really isn't essential to the existence of reality. You get a very low view of the gods. So you read mythology and you see all kinds of weird, bizarre, evil things that the gods do. And they're lying to each other and deceiving each other and committing immorality with each other and with humans and just all kinds of just despicable things that the gods do. And you also get a relatively low view of humanity and a low view of the value of life. Conflict, life grows out of conflict. You see oftentimes in mythology. And then the idea of ethics. In mythology, the idea of the gods and ethics are just kind of two different issues. So ethics just has to do with how we relate to each other, and it has nothing to do with their relationship with the gods or what the gods think, okay? The deities are frequently sexualized in mythology, as you know, and then, of course, they have this kind of cyclical view of existence or history rather than a linear view. But when you compare that to the Bible, of course, is very strongly monotheistic rather than polytheistic. It's very strongly iconoclastic. In other words, the whole idea of the images of the gods is forbidden. You have the absence of conflict in creation. And matter is created and is inanimate. The first principle, the ultimate reality, is spirit, is God, rather than matter. There's, of course, in the Bible, you get this very high, exalted view of God. He's morally perfect. He never sins, that sort of thing. He's always faithful. He's always honest. You get also a very high view of humanity. Humans are made in the image of God, in the Imago Dei. God is the source of life. You get ethical obedience as a religious obligation, a religious duty to God. So my ethical conduct with other human beings on the horizontal level is a response to God, as a part of my duty and my obligation and my obedience to God. God, of course, in Scripture is completely non-sexual, and history is linear rather than circular. So when you compare those two, you realize the Bible just isn't myth. It has none of the characteristics that we see in mythology. It's just completely different. So when we think of the Bible as history, then we have a number of recent developments. Some we've already talked about. One is this whole idea of eyewitness history. So the Gospels now, we know, are in fact eyewitness history. They're not just kind of folk literature that's been developed over many years, but they are in fact eyewitness accounts. And the present consensus, as I said, among scholars today, is that these narratives are based on eyewitness accounts. We have what we talked about with the Jewish scholarship, and then we have archaeology, where we have just countless archaeological discoveries that have been made since the development of archaeology, countless discoveries that have been made that document and support the historicity of the Bible. On the other hand, there have been no archaeological discoveries that disprove any claim or statement of Scripture. Now, sometimes people are going to tell you archaeology has disproved the Bible. What they're really referring to when they say that is this mistaken idea that if archaeology hasn't proven it, then it's false. Okay? So, for example, for many years, for many decades, people just, many scholars just totally dismissed Luke. They thought Luke was just totally off base, because there are many things that Luke says in the Gospels and in Acts that had not been substantiated archaeologically, and so they just assumed they were false. Okay? But as I point out there in your notes, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Okay? So the fact that you don't have evidence for something doesn't mean it's not true, right? So it turned out, as archaeology progressed, we found out that many of these things that people thought Luke was wrong about, he actually was right about. And now Luke is regarded as a first-class, first-century historian by scholars. So when people say to you, archaeology has disproved the Bible, what they're really saying is there are parts of the Bible we haven't proved from archaeology. And there, of course, will always be parts of the Bible we haven't proved from archaeology, because we're talking about things that happened 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. And archaeology is a very fragmentary science and always will be by its nature, right? So there will always be parts of the Bible that we don't have archaeological proof for, but what's striking is how many parts of the Bible we do have archaeological evidence for. So just going back then and just thinking very quickly over things we've learned over the last several weeks, we've learned that we have multiple good reasons to have confidence that the Bible is God's Word. We understand why we accept the books that we do accept, the canon that we have, as opposed to other books that might have been in the canon. And we understand how the Bible is superior to and different from other religious texts. We understand now why we can have confidence that the text we have is an accurate representation of what was originally written. We understand now how scholars approach the Bible in different ways, these different methods of what's called biblical criticism. And we've seen the strengths of some of those and the weaknesses of some of those, and misuses and abuses of some of those. And we've seen that the Bible is not myth, but it is actual history, which becomes a segue then into our next module, which is going to be Christian history. So over the next few weeks, we're going to look at the whole subject of Christianity down through history. Actually, we're going to start a little before the Christian era, because we're going to start by talking about the conquest of Canaan and the defeat of the Canaanites and the expulsion of the Canaanites, because people have questions about that. So that's where we're headed in the next few weeks. So, any questions?